Okay, two things today. For this first hour, and we may try and finish a bit early, I will carry on with the PowerPoint show, talking about Industrial Revolution, people's ideas and so on. And then after what may be a little early break, we shall do another one of our text comprehension exercises where you will read a page from, in fact, two short documents relating to the Industrial Revolution. We will discuss it, and then you will write your responses to two questions about that. Okay, so I'll try and finish a little bit early. We'll have an early break to give ourselves perhaps an hour or so to do that text thing after the break. Okay, let's make a start looking at what we've been doing so far. Well, we're looking at the Industrial Revolution and so on, we all know that. Then the section we're at now is what I've been calling the consequences, social consequences of the Industrial Revolution. We talked about the emergence of the middle classes, capitalism, and working classes. Then we're looking at some intellectual responses to that situation, okay? Some responses to those ideas. I suggested, people may disagree, but I suggested that we could look at some of the ideas of John Stuart Mill in that context. He's talking about how we can make laws, what's the point when we shouldn't interfere with other people's lives. So I put this in the context of reform, a concern with reforming society and so on, which is obviously something that they needed to do at the time, and we'll be looking at that in the text comprehension quiz afterwards. So I think this brings us to this point. It brings us to this gentleman. Lived slightly earlier than Mill, a bit older than him, writing a bit before, but I've put him second. Thomas Malthus. Anyone encountered his name before? I think sometimes my wife might even teach his text in detail. We're not looking at it in detail here, but in a sense you can see his ideas were at least partly a pessimistic response to the developments of the 18th century. Pessimistic means what? You have optimistic and pessimistic. Sorry? Negative, okay? Not so good, okay? You can have a pessimistic view of things, which means that you think it's going to go the wrong way, or it's turning out bad, or you're not happy or something. Optimistic, as you probably know, means a more positive, a happier response. His ideas are set out in his book called Essay on the Principle of Population, and in fact he rewrote that book quite a few times. We've got one date there, but he rewrote it more than once, trying to revise and develop his ideas, okay, trying to clarify what he was concerned with. Now, can anyone remember what was one of the biggest developments in the 18th century during the 1700s that I suggested was partly behind the agricultural revolution and also partly pushing or encouraging the development of the Industrial Revolution? What happened in Western Europe during the 1700s that had a big effect upon society? Anyone remember what it was?
Demand for goods due to the increase in population.
Okay, what I wanted there was population increase. Thank you, Adam. During that period, we saw a 50% increase in the population of Europe, okay, during the 18th century, and that also therefore increases demand for, we said clothing, but food and other things as well. So it may have contributed to, as a pressure towards these big changes. Malthus was concerned with population increase, okay, the principle of population. He's concerned with how and why populations get bigger, and it's perhaps not surprising that someone, in this case him, wrote about this topic at the end of a century when there had been a very big increase in population. He tries to get some statistics together to show that and so on, okay? And he thinks that population increase leads to number of results and so on, but basically he sees it increasing the misery of people, and it has a negative effect on the economy. Okay, so for him, population increase is a problem. So population is increasing, and he discusses that, he shows that. Okay, families are increasing in size, people are not dying so much, we have bigger population, demographic explosion. On the other hand, land, subsistence, land and resources are more limited and increase at a slower rate. Okay. Obviously, ultimately, the resources are limited to the amount of land that exists on the world. Okay. And although we can do things to make land more productive and so on, he says that actual production from land and elsewhere can increase, but the rate of increase is less. So in a sense, you have population doing this and kind of land, resources and so on doing that, okay, increasing at a lower rate. So the problem is obviously that gap there. There is less food to go round. As the population increases, land produces more food, but not enough to feed the population. We've discussed this, again, as a factor behind the agricultural revolution, but he sees it as a big problem. He sees this as a serious problem. There'll never be enough food to feed the ever-increasing population. As the population gets bigger, it gets bigger and bigger at an increasing rate, in a sense. In addition, he was concerned with wages. Okay, he says that what's happening as the population increases is that wages effectively will decrease, will go down. Okay, because the amount of money we have is more or less fixed in the world. Okay, if we increase it too much, of course, it just gets devalued. It's worth less. But the amount of sort of money we have is fixed, so as there are more people, the money is spread around more people, so everyone's share of that gets smaller. So effectively, the wages that people get is less. So we have a bad situation. Too many people, not enough food, and people's wages are decreasing. Okay, they don't even have enough money to pay for the limited food that there is. So he sees this as a big problem. And Malthus suggested a number of solutions to these problems, okay, a number of answers to these. He proposes them. Okay. One which is sometimes described as being positive solution, okay, which is we need to have things which reduce population increase, okay, or let's say somehow decrease population. So that means effectively for him increasing death. We need more people to die, is what he says. If we have more wars, if we have starvation, then effectively more people will die, and therefore population increase is less. So, well, it's not positive from the perspective of the person that's dying, but it means it's a proactive thing. You're actually doing something to actually reduce the population increase by increasing death. Positive from his perspective, and it's bringing the population down, in a sense. Okay. You've got a big population, you need to do something to reduce that, okay? And more deaths are obviously a good thing in that sense, from a purely kind of objective perspective, I suppose. Also, he talked about preventative solutions. So on the one hand, we've got all this population, okay? And we need to make sure that some of you die quickly so that we get a smaller population. That's the first one. Preventative, what would that mean? Anyone? to prevent something.
Decrease the birth rate.
Yeah, okay. So to prevent it happening. So to prevent the population getting bigger in the first place. Okay. So this one is to reduce birth. Okay. So increase death. Okay. So more people die. And secondly, to reduce birth. Okay. And that all ultimately boils down to sex. That's what he's concerned with here. He said we've got to have people having less sex. He encourages abortions so that people who have babies can have them removed. He says we need to encourage, the English word is celibacy. People like priests, Christian priests, who never get married, never have a relationship with a woman and things like that, so they don't go around having children. Okay, people lead a celibate life. They don't have sex or whatever. Birth control, obviously, so that having sex doesn't necessarily lead to pregnancy and things like that. So these would be preventative things to reduce the birth rate, increase the death rate, and reduce the birth rate. Okay, so he was obviously a very kind of jolly man, very happy man, sitting there in his office somewhere in England, thinking of these kind of nice thoughts to make people die and to make them enjoy their lives a bit less in terms of sex and things like that. But for him, it was very important because he could see that there was some catastrophe coming. There would just ultimately be too many people, not enough resources, money is limited, it's going to lead to some terrible economic and social catastrophe. So he suggested these kind of measures should be taken by governments. Now, luckily, no one followed him up too much on that. I mean, obviously, these days, some of the ideas of preventative solutions are important, and in some countries in the world, like India, where you have expanding populations, they're trying to encourage things like birth control and so on. But in general, his ideas have not kind of become big in a big way. But here is one response, from our perspective, a rather strange and perhaps negative one, but one response to this problem of population increase, which we've already seen happening as a factor in the agricultural revolution and then in the industrial revolution as well. And perhaps what we can say is the agricultural revolution, the change in the way that they were farming, and the industrial revolution, the change in the way that they were manufacturing, was an alternative response. It was another solution, okay? It was another change, and this is the positive one. Changing in farming meant we could produce more food and feed the population. The changes in manufacturing meant we could make more clothes and look after the population. So luckily, these two revolutions meant that his rather extreme solutions were not necessarily needed. Okay, any questions there? Is that all clear? We don't need to worry too much about him, but it's worth being aware that he had these ideas kicking around. Okay, let's look at our friend Karl Marx, whom we've mentioned on more than one occasion, of course. Karl Marx was a German Jew, and as I've mentioned on more than one occasion, he spent a certain amount of his active life researching and working in London. Okay, so again, he was at the heart of the Industrial Revolution when it was beginning and developing. So although he was not British himself, he experienced the Industrial Revolution as it was happening in Britain during the middle of the 19th century. He's often seen as the one of the most important socialist thinkers. Okay, so a new set of ideas that were emerging during the 19th century, and obviously communism, as we've experienced it in different forms in the 20th century, at least owing its origins partly to him. So very, very important figure intellectually, but also historically as well. And we talked about the ideas and history factors being on there. So we see him as also a negative reaction to the Industrial Revolution, particularly the social consequences. For what we're going to discuss, it's the consequences, the development of these new classes, and what he sees as exploitation by the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, over the working classes. Okay, so socialism is a social intellectual reaction to what's going on, not just economically, but also socially in 19th century. So that's very important. He's not supporting the Industrial Revolution, he's experiencing it, and he's saying, no, we need to change it, and in fact, we need to change it in a big way. Okay, so he's reacting against it. He's not describing it like Adam Smith or someone. He's reacting to it and saying, no, this needs to be changed, particularly for these people and so on. And obviously, we're going to be focusing on the Communist Manifesto, which Erdem and Sibel, she's not here today, but Erdem and Sibel will be telling us all about that next week. Published in 1848. This is, as we shall find out later on, a very revolutionary year in Europe. There was a big revolution at that time, so it was an appropriate time for him and his friend Friedrich Engels. They are co-authors. This is a co-authored short little pamphlet, really. It's not a very big book. But he also wrote other more important books in terms of economic thinking, like Das Kapital and others, which obviously focus on the sort of economic side. This is more to do with the social side of the period he's living, so it's important for us in that sense. Okay, can anyone remind us, we've mentioned this briefly before, can anyone remind us of his theory of history and the background to that? Okay, very important in understanding the basis for his ideas. What was Marx and Engels' idea of history, which we get set out in a number of places, but in the Communist Manifesto especially? Can anyone remember?
Actually, wasn't that like a circle? I mean, at first there was no private property. When men were hunters and gatherers, and later the agriculture and developments, there were private properties, and which ultimately lead to social classes. And as I remember that he states that after the revolution, there won't be any social classes again, and there won't be private property.
Okay.
Like a circle.
Yeah, okay. We return to an original state or something like that, I suppose. What is the mechanism? What is the way in which history develops in the way that you've described it? Okay.
Clash of classes.
That's right, okay. I've been using two boards here. He says that all history hitherto, or something until now, is the history of class conflict or class struggle, or whatever, okay, which is what we have here. So the basis for historical change are classes. Now, we defined classes in a Marxist sense on Monday. Can anyone remind us what he said was the definition of a class? How would a Marxist, or Marx himself, define people being in a class? It wasn't birth, it wasn't ethnicity, it wasn't hair color.
Where are you standing in the production?
That's right. Your relationship to the means of production. Okay. Are you an owner, or are you someone who just works with it? Okay. So he says that throughout history, in different technological times, when we have different things, different ways of producing things, there have always been those people who control and own those things, whatever they might be, modern factories, land in the Middle Ages and so on, in what he calls the feudal period, and those people who work on it but don't own it. Okay, peasants in the Middle Ages, working class in the industrial modern times. And what happens is that you get a struggle, a conflict between the groups, okay, because obviously there is resentment by the working classes or by the peasants, and they are usually exploited. Okay, they are usually not treated very well, and this leads to conflict and eventually it leads to revolution and change. So most recently, he talks about feudalism leading to a historical change leading to capitalism. Okay. Conflicts between the landowners and the peasants in the feudal period led to a big change which eventually emerges as capitalism, okay, which is what we have now. And as Erdem has said, Marx suggests that the nature of capitalism is just very, very exploitative. The middle classes, the bourgeoisie, are just after profit. They just want to make more money. So the more they exploit the workers, the more factory owner David presses you guys and makes you do things, the more money I make. And the more money I make, the more people I can get, the more I want to exploit. So eventually, capitalism will kind of kill itself because it will just go too far that way. And that will lead to the final revolution, which will lead to the social revolution, socialist revolution, where we will end up with a society where everyone will be essentially equal. Okay? There will be no distinction between classes. And as Adam says, there'll be other changes as well, including the abolition of private property on a large scale. Okay? Private property is the basis for capitalism and so on. What he also says is that I'm not just intellectualizing this. I'm not just suggesting this is my theory. Okay, you can have any theory of history. You can say it's to do with the weather. You can say it's to do with class conflicts. You can say it's to do with economic change or whatever it might be that causes changes in history. He says, I'm not just trying to explain it, intellectualize it. I want change to happen. He wants the social revolution, the socialist revolution to happen. Okay, and so he is presenting this document not just as describing, but as advocating, as requesting. Okay, so he's calling out to the working class people at the time, we need to do the revolution. He's concerned how some of the working classes are not socialist enough, they haven't got to that stage. He's saying some of them need to change and so on, and who's going to lead this revolution and so on. So he's actually wanting to create a revolution at that time. Okay. And one of the most famous phrases from the book is, working people of the world, unite, and so on. You've got nothing to lose but your chains. Come together. You all need to work together, and then you can destroy capitalism, and then we'll have the socialist society that will come afterwards. So he's not just describing it, but he actually wants it to happen, and he wants it to happen now if possible. Okay, so he's a politician as well as an intellectual in that sense. But he's reacting ultimately to what he sees around him, okay? And he doesn't think that governments, because governments are ultimately controlled by the capitalists, he doesn't think governments and changing the law will help the situation, okay? It's not going to make a big change. We need to do something else. We need to take the thing into our own hands. Some intellectual middle-class people working with the working classes will cause the revolution, and so on, okay? And as I said, oddly enough, we will see some little revolutions happening in different parts of Europe at about that time. So he was living at a time when there was actual problems in Europe leading to conflicts and so on. So here is a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, a negative reaction, and someone who's suggesting we need to change it, we need to move on, we need to create something a little bit different. Okay, mentioned this gentleman a few times already as well. Please, we've had this conversation at least once before, if not twice. Can someone remind us why we include Charles Darwin, a biologist, in our consideration of the Industrial Revolution and of industrial thinkers like Adam Smith or Marx? What is the logic? What is the reason why I've put him here? Tuja?
Selection is connected to powerful gains power and poor people poorer with the capitalist system because of that.
Okay, so the phrase survival of the fittest, which was not, I don't think, actually used by Darwin himself. It's something which comes later on. But the idea, we said, was competition, struggle. Okay, so we have people like Smith advocating or asking for competition within an economic context. We have Marx understanding history through conflict, through class struggle, as we've said. And here we see biological change, evolution as it becomes known, as understood according to the idea of conflict and struggle as well. Okay, so that's the basic idea, that we can understand the mechanisms of his ideas within the context of similar thinkers at the time, okay, from this industrial period, from the middle of the middle part of the 19th century. He wrote a number of books, but his first one to have big impact, called On the Origins of Species, I think it's by means of natural selection. Okay, the concept of natural selection, very important here. And obviously, he is an important and, for some people, controversial figure because of what becomes known as the theory of evolution. I myself would point out that it's not a theory, it's a fact. Okay, things do evolve. We have all evolved. Humans have evolved in a very small way in the past few thousands of years. So theory is a bad word because it suggests somehow that it's still open to debate. But I know in Turkey and other parts of the world, many people don't agree with the idea that animals, species, including humans, have evolved and will continue to evolve. And of course we will. That's my opinion. But we're not concerned with opinion here. We're not concerned with whether it's right or wrong. We're concerned with understanding these ideas and why they developed and so on. So let's say a little bit about the basic principles of evolution as developed by Darwin and then developed further later on. He was not the first evolutionary thinker. He was taking up other people who had had similar basic ideas before, but he was the most famous advocate of evolution through his studies and travels around the Pacific and elsewhere during his early life. Once again, we have the fact that resources, land, food, whatever it might be, ultimately, most importantly, of course, food is limited. So the food that animals can get anywhere is up to a point limited. Okay? So any animals are faced with limited food and with competition for that food. Okay. Two lots of animals, whether they come from the same kind of animal or different animals, all want the same fruit in the tree, or they want to kill the same mammal or something and eat it themselves, whatever it might be. So one of the basic points is that resources are limited, okay, and that leads to a situation of competition between animals for that. That's the first starting point, we can say. Secondly, and this is more important, is the concept of variation. What do we understand by that word, variation? Can we come up with some other English words for variation? Variety, well, that's etymologically the same thing. Variety, which means anything else? Diverse, okay. Other one, simpler one, ultimately. Difference, okay, is perhaps the simplest word. But, okay, variety, diversity, and so on, it's all the same. Okay, but we're saying any species, any set of animal has variations in it. not all animals are the same. Okay? You look at all of us in this room, we're all members of Homo sapiens sapiens, human beings, but we don't look the same. Okay? We have different hair color, blah, blah, blah. That's on a very simple, basic level. But all animals contain variations, okay? Little differences between certain members of the species. Okay? And this variation, he says, is... what am I doing? I can't even write properly. It is hereditary. It is inheritable. Okay? So something which is different about me, okay? In my case, for example, I've got this little mark on the bottom of my chin you can see here. This is something which not everyone in this room has. This is, we could call that a variation, I suppose. And my daughter has a slightly less marked little cleft thing on her thing, and my father has got it, okay? So I've inherited this little chin problem, whatever, not problem, but feature, and my daughter's got it from me. And this is not an important one, but other differences in terms of size, in terms of a long neck or something, can also be passed on from one animal to its offspring. Okay? These variations are inheritable, and that's important as well. So we have all these animals with variations competing for limited resources, okay? And living in certain contexts, living in certain environments. And those variations which are suited to a particular environment and help in the competition for resources in that environment, okay, will help that particular animal to survive. Okay? If on one day the tall animal and the small animal are both hungry, the tall animal gets the food and eats it, and he stays alive. The small animal can't get the food, and he dies. And once he's dead, he's not able to pass on his variation, his small variation in this case, to any children, because if you're dead, you can't have children. Okay? So survival here leads to reproduction. Okay? Those that survive will live longer and will produce more children, will produce more offspring, and those children will inherit the variations, okay? And that will help them to win in the next competition when they are adults, and they will pass on the variation themselves and so on. So, limited resources in the context of variation among animals leads to the survival of some and the death and ultimately extinction of others. And what you eventually get is new species emerging, okay, characterized by slightly different features, characterized by slightly different appearances and so on. There's been quite a lot of talk recently about Neanderthal man. You know Neanderthals? You come out, you know what that is? Anyone? I don't know if it's spelt the same way in Turkish or not. Who were the Neanderthals? Do we know?
There was a documentary in National Geographic, I remember.
Right.
People, well, they are actually different species than us. I mean, they look like us, but they have beak.
Yeah, they have lower brows and things like that.
Yeah,
Chins is different and things like that.
They are not our ancestors. Actually, they are a different species, but they extinct.
Yes. They occupied Europe and parts of the Middle East, I think, probably before the ancestors of modern humans reached those areas. So eventually you had a situation where you had two sets of similar but different humans competing for resources, okay, which means mammoths to kill and other things like that. The old idea was that modern humans, our ancestors, our prehistoric ancestors, more or less wiped out Neanderthals. Either they killed them, or through this kind of thing, they simply were more clever and they were able to kill the animals themselves, and the Neanderthals died out and so on. It's now been suggested that there was in fact some interbreeding between Neanderthals and modern humans, and those of us that live in Europe and Asia have a little bit of Neanderthal genetics in us, whereas the Africans don't, because they stay behind in Africa and they didn't go over to Europe and meet Neanderthals or whatever. This is a new idea. They're debating these things. Obviously, they'll work it all out. And genetics is one of the areas that has proven the basic principles of evolution as set out by Darwin and others. But there's one interesting kind of example. Okay, one species survives us and the other species disappears. Now, whether they just get bred out, whether we just bred with them and became us, whether we killed them, whether they just died out because they were not able to compete with us in terms of killing animals and picking the fruit, I don't know the full story. But that is a case of a similar species, very similar, that has disappeared. Okay? And we have common ancestors, we would say, back in Africa or whatever, but they were definitely our cousins rather than our direct ancestors in that sense. One of the problems with Darwinism, as indicated here, is that the basic idea for most scientists today is sound basic principle, and genetics has provided the mechanism to show how this happens. Genetic variation and all these other things can be seen by looking at our genes and so forth, so we understand the actual mechanisms now. But the idea he applies primarily to animals, to biology. Okay, that was his concern. But quite soon after these ideas were made known and were debated very strongly at the time, the Church of England was people were against this idea because they thought it was attacking Christianity and so on. But very quickly people took this idea and then applied it to society. Okay? And the concept survival of the fittest was not something, as I said, that Darwin himself talked about, though it kind of describes in a way what we're talking about here, but fittest, strongest is perhaps not quite the right word. Survival of the most adaptable variation might be more a close description of what he would have said. But survival of the fittest then is taken into this social Darwinist context. Okay. There was an English thinker called Herbert Spencer in the 19th century that tried to apply these ideas to social human society and so on. And then ultimately you can even trace these ideas down to someone like Adolf Hitler. Okay, you can even say the crazy ideas of the Nazis and other fascists in the 20th century derive their origin from Darwin. I'm sure Darwin himself would have been very upset if he'd known that his scientific ideas were twisted and taken into the wrong context and the basis for what were obviously very horrific things. But the idea of the survival of the fittest then gets out there. And of course in the later 19th century, as Europeans begin to conquer large parts of Africa, okay, that it becomes, in a way, the concept of racism. They begin to say, these black people in Africa are somehow not the same as us, and they are inferior. We are the ones who are the fittest. That's why we are ruling them. And all these terrible colonialist and negative ideas about other parts of the world, a very Eurocentric perspective, can at least partly be affected by social Darwinism as well. So you have to separate these two things and say, well, one's scientific, the other is social. And obviously they shouldn't be put together in that way. Okay, any questions there? Let's take a quick, okay, let's finish off, because I said we finish early, but it's not very early. Let's put your hands up if you believe that we have evolved, that human beings as we stand now are the product of an evolutionary process that has led to us being here now. And those of you at the back, don't subscribe to this idea. Okay, so that's Out of the students, it's 50-50, okay? And oddly enough, I think it's about that in the United States, okay? About 50% of Americans do not believe in scientific evolution. They believe in other ideas and so on. Not as much time as I'd hoped, but we'll do the same thing that we did 2 weeks ago, okay? You can spend the next 20 minutes or so reading this text and asking me about words or phrases you don't understand. Then we will spend a couple of minutes discussing it, and then for the rest of the class, I'll ask you to write answers, responses to these short questions here. So let's start as soon as possible with reading these texts, okay? And I have to reread it because I haven't read it for a while. And again, Emre, this bit you can cut out or whatever, and we'll jump straight to the discussion afterwards. So we've got, say, 10 minutes to discuss this. Okay, 2 texts focusing on 2 different aspects of the Industrial Revolution. What is the main subject and purpose of the first text, the slightly longer one? What's it trying to tell us there, do you think? What's the topic that it's covering?
Working conditions in factories are not good for human health.
Right, okay. So they're unhealthy conditions. And what is the result? What happens because of these? What is the main description they've got here of the result of these bad conditions? Is it disease, or is it intellectual stupidity, or what are they to? Right, it's mainly physical, isn't it? So the factories and the conditions of the hands, the workers, are poor, and particularly when they're children, it seems to stress, as they grow up and develop, physically they have problems. What problems do they get? What are the things it says? There's a whole list of them here. We don't need to go through them all, but give me some examples. Sorry? Okay, injuries development is the key. So what are these people like? They're short mainly. It says on average they're smaller. I know it says, was it 5 foot 6 inches, which you may not be familiar with, not being from Britain, but an average man these days is about 5 foot 10 or 11 inches. Tall people are 6 foot and more, and so on. So 6 inches is a little bit below average. So they're saying these people do not grow up to be as tall as they should be. Okay, perhaps because they're not being fed well, or because of the conditions of their working and so on. Anything else? What else does it say?
They have some psychological problems. For example, they take bad men unreasonably.
Yes, okay. So it has a psychological effect upon their mental development as well as their physical one, and they are looking kind of depressed and so on and things like that. They're also mainly very thin, okay. It talks about their appearance. They are very kind of white skinned, they're not going outside much, okay. They're thin as well. Their hair is straight and lank and so on. What about the guys? Something that happens to the guys, it's not relevant to the ladies in this context, but something else to do with hair. Yeah, they don't really have proper, they can't grow proper beards. It says like American Indians, like the red Indians in America, it says, okay. They can't even grow the proper beards in the way that a healthy man can, and so on. And what about the issue of children in particular? What's the importance of children for all this?
Children are not yet developed, so under those working, they'll misdevelop or develop.
Yeah, I mean, physically a bad adult is just a grown-up bad child. So the fact that children are working in these conditions, that's the reason that people are small and weak and white and so on, because they had to work in those conditions when their bodies were developing as children, and then they didn't obviously develop properly. They have bent backs and so on because they were doing this kind of work when they were children. Okay, so the children are important there. And I've mentioned at least once before in the class that at this time children were working in the factories. Okay, they had a purpose. The whole family was involved in working in the factories and so on. Do you think this is a positive or a negative description? Are they trying to be positive or negative here? Or just descriptive, maybe just purely objective, saying what it's like? Any ideas? Yeah, mainly negative, I think. You can't say all these things. You can't be a decent human being, describe all this, read it, and then not feel bad. Okay, so probably they're trying to make people think that we need to change something, we need to look after the children at least, and things like that. Okay, they're not just describing something in an objective way, they're trying to present a negative impression and things like that. Okay, what about the second one then? What's that one about? What's the main focus of the second text? Working hours. It's the amount of time that you spend working. Okay. And what is the point? Number of points he's making here. There's one very important phrase. Okay, I wrote up the word avarice there. Greed. Seda asked about that. Greedy means you want lots of things. Avarice is a fancy word for desiring more. Okay. In this case, the avarice of the masters is they want more profit. They want more productivity, and that leads to more profits. Okay, and because of that, they will then make the workers work for longer hours. That's the key to that one. Okay, but there's an important sentence. I'll find it because it's kind of important, I think. Okay, and those who have wished for the hours of labour to be less for all ages than the legislature, than the law would even yet sanction. So there are some factory owners, he's saying, who would like to put the hours down. Okay. For those who would like the hours of labour to be less, for children as well as adults, even less than the law says. The law says maximum working time for anyone is this number of hours a week. Some people might even want to go less. Okay. But those people who want it to be less have no alternative but to conform more or less to the prevailing practice, the standard practice, or abandon the trade altogether, or they lose out. Now why? This is quite an important point. Okay. Exactly. If nasty factory owner Erdem is making his workers work for 80 hours a week and producing lots of stuff, but nice factory owner Yaz comes along and says, well, I'm a nice guy, we'll do 20, and everyone says, oh, isn't that nice? But of course he's going to produce less, and therefore he can't compete with Erdem, and so he goes out of business. Okay, he has to abandon the trade, he has to abandon the business altogether. Now, the government, this is an English example, the government was trying to regulate the number of hours, still quite high by our standards compared to what we have today. But he's saying, even when the law is here, some people think it's fairer to be lower, but we can't do that, because then the people who are sticking to the law, they will still make more profit and they will defeat me in competition or whatever. So everyone has to more or less follow the law, whatever it is, okay, conform to the law. So that's an important point there, okay. Is this one a negative or positive thing? Is this trying to argue that we should reduce hours or not, do you think, from this? We should reduce. I mean, the book, someone who was a member of Parliament, it says, John Fielden, The Curse of the Factory System is what it's called. And here he begins this paragraph. Here then is the curse of the factory system. Curse means a bad thing, okay? So he's clearly writing a negative little pamphlet, a magazine or book, whatever it is, about the factory system as he saw it in the first half of the 19th century. And he's discussing specifically here working hours. There are obviously other parts of his book, I presume, where he looks at other things. But he's obviously trying to press down the working hours. But he's saying when the law comes, we have to fit in with the law. Otherwise, we can't be competitive anymore in that sense. Okay. The overworking does not apply to children only, but adults are also overworked. Okay, so he here also again mentions the issue of children working, says that it's the same problem for both, but he recognises that children are working. He doesn't say that children shouldn't work, just that they should work fewer hours. Okay, in that sense, which is interesting. Again, from our perspective, where we think all children should be going to school and playing outside and things, he has a slightly different perspective on that because he's living at that time. Okay, any other comments about these? Any things that struck you as interesting? Anything you want to add? Yik yak yok. All right, now, we've got half an hour or so. So you've got the text. You can ask me any questions about words, anything you didn't understand. Again, Sybil, you came late, so you have a slight disadvantage, but do your best. Fill in the blank, and if you run out of space, you can write on the other side. Okay. Try and answer these two questions. The first one, what aspects of the Industrial Revolution do these two texts illustrate? Now, they don't talk about everything. Okay. We've only got one page of A4, so we can't cover everything. So we're looking at certain aspects. You want to say what they are, what aspects, why we would call them something to do with the Industrial Revolution, what makes them significant and relevant to the Industrial Revolution as opposed to something else. Okay. And the second question, perhaps more important for the second text, what was the reason for reform as described in these two texts? They both can answer that question, but the second one, perhaps a little bit more, is relating to the concept of law and change. But they both refer to some of the problems and so on. But the second one specifically says legislature, which means law. Okay, so think about what we're talking about, reform, and then see if you can answer that one there. Okay, first one is easy, second one may require a little bit more thinking. Any questions, any ideas, you can put your hand up and I'll try and help.